Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It is a thrill to be back here in Austin. Austin has been good to me. The deaf community has been good to me. So I really wanted to be here today for those reasons. So let me tell you straight out what my idea is. My idea is this, that American Sign Language needs to stop being the language of the deaf, and it needs to start being the language of community, communication, and visual experience. Now, that's a radical hypothesis. Let me explain where I come from in saying that. A little bit about my own history first. I was born deaf. My mother had rubella, but she chose to raise me oral. So I never learned sign language while I was growing up. So culturally, I'm a hearing person. That's where I come from. However, Gallaudet invited me to spend a year on campus. And that was a very generous invitation, especially given the complicated history of cochlear implants at Gallaudet University. So it was a very open-minded invitation. Gallaudet basically said, come and learn, we'd like to learn from you. So I learned a little bit of sign. One thing I learned is that it was much more difficult for me to learn than I expected. I think when you're 44, it's hard to learn any foreign language. But I got at least a taste of it. So I come here today as a respectful outsider. I can't tell you the future of deafness. I can't tell you the future of Gallaudet. I can only propose to you some ideas. So let me give you two numbers. The first is that by the year 2100, 50% of the languages on Earth will be extinct. The reason is assimilation. The parents want their children to learn the language of the majority. They want their child to learn English, to learn Mandarin Chinese, to learn Tamil, and so forth. Language is spoken by billions of people. And so for that reason, minority languages are dying out. The second number that I want to give you is that 96% of deaf children are born to parents who are hearing. 96%. To those parents, it's a complete shock when their child is born deaf. They know nothing about the deaf community. They know nothing about ASL. What they want is for their child to grow up using the same language that they do. And that's very understandable. I don't think there's any conspiracy by the medical establishment to wipe out deafness. I just don't think that's what's happening. It's that the vast majority of parents with deaf children, when their doctor said to them, I can give your child a device that will enable them to hear, almost all of them will say yes. So this is a historical reality. This is not something that can be wished away. This is simply happening. In Australia, schools for the deaf, for the signing deaf, are closing in huge numbers. The same is happening in Europe. And in many states in this country, school districts that originally used sign language for their children are now switching over to teaching children English from the start. And much of the reason is because of cochlear implants. So these are profound tectonic shifts. These are earthquakes that the sign and deaf community and all deaf people need to think about. Now, my own concern with this comes from an understanding of the importance of diversity. So my sign is very limited. But one thing I've learned at Gallaudet is that sign language allows new ways of understanding the world. So, along with Josh Swillen, who wrote a wonderful book about going to Africa, being a Peace Corps volunteer in Africa, along with Josh, we co-taught a course at Gallaudet, and we looked at various minority groups, and we asked, how have they adapted to change? So we looked, for example, at the Jews in the Middle Ages, where they were a very oppressed minority. We looked at how they adapted by doing the only thing that educated Jews could do in those days, which was banking. And they prospered in that niche. We looked at blacks during slavery, and we asked, how did black people protect and maintain their culture during a time of great oppression? And we looked at how musical forms, such as jazz, for example, emerged. We looked at gays. You know, today, it's a little hard to believe, but 50 years ago, gays were the most unpopular minority in America. Gayness was considered a disease. But now, that has completely changed. Gays have become much more woven into the fabric of today's culture and today's society. How did they do that? So in the course, we looked at one way, which was through the media. Gays got involved in producing films and television shows where gay people were presented as not just gay people, but as people who had normal lives with the same concerns, issues, fears, and hopes as the rest of us. So we looked systematically at how different minorities have adopted strategies for adapting to change. And in fact, at least two of our students are in the audience here today, so I'm really happy to see them. So let me offer you some ideas for how deaf people can bring about that change. And my perspective tends to be focused on Gallaudet. First, because I spent a year there, so I'm more familiar with Gallaudet than I am with other centers of deaf community. But Gallaudet is really the only university in the United States where the primary language on campus is American Sign Language. There are many other programs, like Rochester, like Cal State, at Northridge, for example. But Gallaudet is really unique in that its culture is focused on sign language. So, our students came up with very innovative ideas for rethinking the use of sign language. So, one of our students, they were groups of students, one of our students proposed a really neat idea, which was to create retreats, where the focus of the retreat was vision and the possibilities of vision. But to offer this kind of experience to hearing people, to invite hearing people to think more thoughtfully about the role of vision in their lives. Another idea was to create forms of art that depended on an interaction between vision and vibration. So to create sculptures where hitting them would create resonant sound waves that invited people to rethink that sound is not just something for the hearing, it's also something for the deaf. So a lot of very innovative ideas were brought up during this course. And for me, one of the deepest ideas is the idea that the visual language offers certain kinds of truth about human life that are not available in spoken languages. Hearing people are actually very interested in that kind of thing. ASL is a very commonly taught language in universities around the country. So a lot of hearing people will actually take a year or 2 or 3 years learning ASL. But the problem is, what do they do with that knowledge afterward? So it kind of becomes an experience that's contained within the college campus. It doesn't really go with them into the outside world. So an idea that I want to offer is that Gallaudet can think about admitting more hearing people. Right now, Gallaudet has a cap on the number of hearing undergraduates that it can enroll. That cap is 5%. So that means the hearing people are very much a minority on the Gallaudet campus. Now consider that Gallaudet's enrollment has been shrinking. In the last 5 or 6 years, its enrollment has dropped from 1,400 to less than 1,000. That's the undergraduate enrollment. So even deaf people are often not coming to Gallaudet. But at the same time, Gallaudet is saying, well, only 5% of the population can be hearing. So my suggestion is remove that cap and invite hearing people to come to Gallaudet, not just to study the language of the deaf, but much more deeply and much more profoundly a language of visual communication and a language of community. Community is a big sore point in America these days. There's a very influential book titled Bowling Alone that came out about 10 years ago. And the author of that book looked at these long-term studies about how people engage in community behavior. There are these questionnaires that have been distributed for 50 years, asking people, how many times did you entertain at home in the last year? How many times did you meet with friends in the past month? How many friends do you have? And it's very clear from looking at those numbers that in American society, those numbers have dropped precipitously in the past 40 years. People have fewer friends now than they did 40 years ago. They give fewer parties. They go to fewer parties. Why? Well, one reason is technology. Television makes it possible for people to stay home and be entertained. Not only that, so does air conditioning, by the way. Because when air conditioning became popular, then people would just stay home instead of going out to the theater, going out and visiting friends. So technology has really played a huge and negative role in community life here in America. And a lot of people feel that. Hearing people and deaf people. People are groping for a new sense of community. How do we live in communities that sustain us? There are, I forget the exact statistic, but I think that roughly half of people in this country have one major relationship, say a spouse or a significant other, such that if they lost that person, they would instantly lose most of their social network. So people are just less plugged in than they used to be. So people are really hungry for lessons in community, for wisdom of how you sustain communities. I'm not going to say that Gallaudet is an ideal community. I've learned that it too has many tensions that it too has its own internal conflicts and divisions. That's become very well known. But nonetheless, I would sit in the cafeteria and I noticed that the students would spend 2 hours talking with each other over lunch. And I asked one of my hearing students, do you see this back at your home university? She was visiting for a semester. And she said, no, at my home university, students come to the cafeteria, shuffle pruning for 15 minutes, and rush off to class. So I really noticed, people would sit down and talk for long periods of time at Gallaudet. So I don't know how much to read into that, because it was difficult for me to be really part of those conversations. The language barrier was huge. Nonetheless, I felt very welcome at Gallaudet. I felt that people really wanted to communicate with me. They were very eager to welcome me to that campus. I felt that I could not take full advantage of that just because of the language barrier. So it was a difficult year. It was a place where I felt very welcomed, but I also felt very limited in how much I could participate in that community. It seems to me that Gallaudet could solve its enrollment problem at a stroke by changing its mission. By no longer being a university for the deaf, and becoming a university that is about communication, community, and vision. Now that would be a radical and profound change, not just for Gallaudet, but for all the people at Gallaudet. And it requires a real rethinking of what is the deaf community? What is it about? Where is it going? And so it means having a more inclusive perspective. That Gallaudet, as a university, can be a focus of hope, not just for the deaf, but for the hearing as well. So that's the main idea that I want to leave you with. And I'll just say one more thing, because I have 30 seconds left. One thing that I would love to see is better teaching of American Sign Language. So when I took courses at ASL, the texts were 20 years old. The instructor had to explain that the numbers in those texts were now no longer used. So it was really important to have better teaching of ASL. And that's it. So that's the idea I want to leave you with, about the idea of a profound change in what deafness means in this country. Thank you very much.